I'm very pleased today that we have Dr. Sam Fabian of Imperial College, who's agreed to talk to us this afternoon. Despite having degrees from Oxford and Cambridge in insect behaviour and biological sciences, Sam actually works with a team of engineers, it seems. So you're with friends today, Sam, so please be reassured. Sam's research at Imperial has focused on trying to understand how insects relate to each other, particularly when they're on the wing. And most recently, he's been hitting the headlines in the popular press following publications which help to answer that age-old question, why is the moth attracted to the flame? Something which so many of us in entomology perhaps exploit and wonder about perhaps still. So Sam's talk is going to explain about his use of photography to allow examination of what is really going on. During the talk, it would be best perhaps if everybody could turn their videos and microphones off, if you wouldn't mind. Please do think about questions while the talk is happening and place those into the chat if you wouldn't mind. And then at the end of the talk, Zoe kindly will be presenting those questions to Sam at the end. So I will introduce now Sam, who's going to talk on using slow motion video to explore insect flight behavior. Thanks very much, Sam.
Thank you very much, Ray. I'll just wait for my screen to load up. Okay, hopefully everyone should be able to see my screen. Could someone just give me a confirmation? Because otherwise I'll give this entire talk.
It's all good.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, I see it.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, yeah, no, thank you very much for that introduction. So yeah, my name's Sam and I work at Imperial College London, where I'm a research associate. And I use slow motion video along with the rest of my lab to explore insect flight behavior. And while I work with a lot of engineers who are very interested in what those insects do, because then they can exploit that and put it on drones and other horrible things, I don't care about that. I care about bugs. So it's very, very good to be around people who also care about bugs. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of audio feedback. If everyone could just make sure they're muted, that would be really handy. Oh, thank you very much. Right, so this is a video that I took in my back garden. Unfortunately, because of the way Zoom works, it's going to be a little choppy. But this is on a kind of spring day, much like the one that's happening outside. And as you sit the camera there and I allow it to track, so each successive frame is anything that's brighter than the previous frame is being added to this video. And what we see is our insects, just hundreds and hundreds of insects moving their way through the air. And this is something that's often missed when we look at just preserved specimens or we look at just photos alone. It's really only in video, and has to be quite fast video in order to capture the speed at which these insects are moving, that we see what so much of the weird features about insects are really about, especially if you're thinking about something like dragonflies, flies, butterflies. They're really built to move through the air. But actually, it's really hard to see what an insect is doing in the air because they're traveling really, really fast for their size. And so I'm going to take you through some of the things that we've been looking at with our high-speed cameras and the ways in which we approach this. And what this generally involves is having two high-speed cameras. So this is actually set, this is them on the left of the screen. That is two high-speed cameras able to shoot at 1,000 frames per second. Your average camera nowadays on a mobile phone can do about 60. So we're able to slow down what's happening in front of us by about 20 to 40 times, depending on what you're comparing it to. And then we're able to use these two cameras taking photos at the same time at that really high rate to get a 3D perspective on any behavior that we see. So this is my colleague, Dr. Lin, moving around a checkerboard, and that allows us to calibrate the space in front of the cameras. So now anything we see in both cameras, we can judge how close or far away it is. And that allows us full 3D reconstruction. Because it's all very well for me to qualitatively say, oh, look at the pattern that this goes. But some reviewer is going to be nasty to me. And so I need to actually have the data and have the kinematics, is what we call it. But that's really stuff like speed, the velocity vectors, the accelerations, and these sort of things. I'll try and keep that really crunchy stuff to a minimum. I'm happy to chat about it later if anyone wants to. But we'll talk about some of the results that this work gives us. And I'm going to start by thinking about where I started in all this, which was in pursuit. So we saw in that first video that those insects weren't just moving randomly around the space. There were clusters where we found more insects than others. And also, unfortunately, I don't have the video up now, but some of those insects are moving together. And that's a really, really common feature, especially this time of year. If you go outside and you just sit down in the flower bed and you look, you'll see like tiny little surface-to-air missiles, tiny little flies launching off plants and chasing anything that flies overhead, like bumblebees. So I want to start talking about the way that chasing works when you're feeding, and I'm going to start with robber flies. I'm going to talk a little bit about fighting, where I'm going to talk about house flies. I'm going to talk about mating and a little bit of the work we've been doing with mayflies. And then finally, I'll talk about how dragonflies switch between different tasks, because your average male dragonfly has to do all 3 of those on the wing. And then right at the end, I'll come and talk about applying the same techniques to understanding or trying to understand what's going on with insects flying around light at night. But let's start with feeding with robber flies. Now, this is a fantastic robber fly. Unfortunately, it's not one of ours. This is an American species. This is Holcocephala fusca. And you can see here it's got a little staphylinid beetle, I think. Somebody else will correct me and tell me I'm wrong. This is about 7 millimeters long, so very, very small robber fly. But one thing that you can see particularly with this species are its eyes. And as we go across that eye, that's not just perspective, those lenses in the eye are getting much, much larger across a central region. And what does that mean? Well, that could mean that they're increasing sensitivity. It could also mean that they're increasing that angular resolution. They could be able to see, they could be trying to see more photons, or it could be that they're trying to see smaller objects further away. And so by looking through the eye, we can take a look at the size of the lenses and then how far away the receptors are. And that's what you see in the sort of purplish slice through the eye that's been cut laterally on the right-hand side. And you can see how massive the lenses are at the front of the eye. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Hopefully you can. Oh, I have an annotate button. Let's see what this does. Okay, so we've got the size of these lenses and how this distance is really, really long compared to the lenses that are at the side of the eye. And that shows that they've really swapped the front part of their eye for binoculars. And so they're able to see with a resolution that's pretty much the same as a dragonfly, despite the fact that eye is really, really small. And eyes are like many things, the bigger, the better. And it's astonishing that these insects are able to see with this fantastic resolution at great distance. But why do they need this fantastic resolution? What are they going to do with it? Well, if this system would let me move to my next slide, I can show you. The robber flies are hunters, as I'm sure most of the audience know. You should be able to see here that we have both a kind of actual hunt going on the right-hand side and a artificial hunt on the left. And so that's my horrible giant eye blinking at the same rate at which this insect is operating. And this actually is why we need these cameras. It's not just about kind of capturing and recording the motion, but it's also that this is the only way in which we're able to slow down the behavior enough that we can actually see it. Because if this entire behavior happens within an eye blink, you're not really able to process it. So we have these interceptions, and this is what we're doing. So this is what I started with my PhD doing, recording these in 2 fields of view. And we now know that these insects are using similar methods to surface-to-air missiles to go and hit their targets. But one of the questions we were asking is what happens if an obstacle gets in the way of that? And so what you're going to see here is my head down at the bottom. This kind of black bar in the middle is a bar of acetate, so just a black sheet that's been spread across. And then we've got a target that's moving from left to right across the screen. And we can see the Holcocephala, the robber fly, surges forwards before doing the climb. And we can start thinking about, well, how does an insect deal with both trying to avoid an obstacle and trying to hit a target at the same time? And the way that we approach this is to ask whether or not it was just what we call linear combination, which is just multiple systems working at the same time. So we combine our knowledge of how insects intercept targets. So you've got target interception, and that's a simulation on the left of how this insect hits its targets. And we combine that with a very, very simple obstacle avoidance algorithm that simply takes that something's expanding in your field of view and that you should steer away from it based on that expansion in your field of view as you get closer to something. And we just add those 2 on top of each other. And it's really as simple as that. And what you're going to see is the real fly is going to take a course as shown in white. Just if it was doing the interception and ignoring the obstacle will be in blue, and the red will be the obstacle avoidance algorithm that includes an added interception and obstacle avoidance at the same time. And so you can see the pure interception just goes straight up and past the obstacle. But actually the real fly and our simulation both surge forwards around that obstacle. And I think this is really interesting because it tells you that even while insects are completely locked on for the kill, they're still processing. There's lots of parallel processing going on. And all of this is being done by a brain the size of a grain of sand at reaction times that may be 5 to 6 times faster than ours. And I think that's really what's astounding. And it's what's so frustrating when people tell me things like, oh, but insects, small brain, dumb. That's not what it means. Insects are fantastically finely tuned. They are beautifully finely tuned. It doesn't mean they can do lots of different things. You know, they're not necessarily plastic, but they are really, really well tuned to what they need to do. And the ability of this system to do this is incredible. So how do we shift from, say, hunting to something like fighting? And so this is some work that I started during the pandemic. And so like everyone, I was trapped indoors and I was miffed to be losing, you know, field seasons and some wonderful field trips that I booked to India. And I was looking up at the ceiling and I saw this, which is a housefly. It is a lesser housefly, which is Phania canicularis. And it's cruising around a lampshade. This is actually something you see a lot in pubs. You see it a lot in anywhere where they've got an open door or an open window. You get these flies collecting underneath a central lampshade and hanging around waiting for a female. And they look like they're just aimlessly kind of flying around. But it's actually a very tightly controlled territorial patrol. So here is a reconstruction of that fly moving around, and it's flashing to yellow every time it makes a turn. And so you can see that this structure is made up of straight lines and turns. And this is what we call saccadic. So that's similar to the idea of your eye. Your eye makes jumps around unless it's tracking something. So we call it saccadic because it saccadically jumps like your eye does. And so the turns aren't continuous. It's not just traveling in a circle. But as this starts to build up, we start to see this kind of regular pattern emerging that is really trying to hold on to this territory underneath this landmark. And we think it's something to do with the fact that females come and land on the landmark and that this male that's sitting just underneath and already got his engine fully revved up and ready to go is in the best place to intercept that female. But I'd say it's still relatively poorly understood exactly why this is a good thing to do. It's all very well to be this little housefly who you're going to see here cruising around underneath your landmark when somebody else comes in. And you can see here how this male adjusts its body posture. So it's flying along in this vertical body posture. As it gets buzzed by this other housefly, it's going to tilt forward and enter into that chase. And does that end up looking like the kind of predatory interceptions that I showed you at the start? Well, what happens if it goes wrong? Well, you could get caught. So you can see here that these are houseflies that are catching each other in midair. It looks very aggressive. And indeed, they kind of yank onto each other's wings and quite often bodily throw each other around like some sort of wrestlers. It doesn't necessarily mean this is meant. These are relatively unscientific words to use. Meant as an aggressive action. It could be also the way that they catch females and that they just assume that all small moving targets are females. But all the same, you can assume this is something that a male housefly doesn't want to happen to it. If anything, it's just taking it away from patrolling underneath a lampshade. And actually, if you take a thread and you hang a black bead underneath a lampshade, the male houseflies will come up and attack that bead repeatedly, and then they'll settle into an orbit lower down. So they will assume that's the dominant male. So there's definitely some sort of hierarchy being determined by these interactions. How do you avoid this happening, though? Well, you're going to see that here with a male that comes from down and left, and then they're going to spiral around each other. So this is a really interesting evasive technique. So I'll let that play again, because I'm not quite sure what the frame rate is doing over Zoom. But you'll see these two houseflies kind of engaged in this mutual downward spiral. And we can view this from beneath as well. So if I film this from beneath, we're going to see the two houseflies spiral around each other. And it really looks like an orbit, almost like you've got two things that are gravitationally attracted to each other spinning around. And I think what's so important to look at here is that it's symmetric. If you watch as they turn, each one is turning at the same time as the other. They're both locked onto each other. And I think this is one of the key differences between male-male interactions and something like a predation where you're hunting. Because if you are a fox chasing a rabbit, there is a pretty much 0% chance, or it's not zero, but very unlikely that your rabbit is going to turn around and try and eat you and chase you. So your roles are predefined before the engagement. But in houseflies, when there's two males fighting, well, the roles are more flexible. You can turn the tail on your aggressor and swap over. So here we can track them from beneath, and this is a real trace of the bodies of both of these insects, with the head marked by a dot and the body marked by a line. And then we can say, look at the angle that their body is making to the line of sight that connects them. And the line of sight is just the line that directly connects the two flies together. So you can think of the dotted line as being the direction of the other fly, and the blue or the red line being the direction of the body of each of these animals. Indeed, that's exactly what we see. We see that they're both turning towards each other the whole time, until one of them, in this case the red one, loses track of the other, and then it's shooting off to try and escape. While the blue one, you can see this blue line go and join the dotted line, which means it's really well locked onto the target. So it's a competition about sensory lock. It's a competition about who can stay on the other. And this is quite familiar. So how does this help us understand how they switch roles, and how do they switch roles? Well, here you're going to see a starting chaser, which is in red, coming up behind a starting evader that's in blue. So they start in these two roles. So you could think of red being the predator and blue being the prey. But your prey doesn't often do this, which is do a downward turn, slow down, and end up behind the one that was initially the predator. So we're seeing here a change in roles, and this dive and spiral seems to be the real key to switching these roles. But what's really interesting, and for anyone who has maybe served in the RAF or knows a lot about combat flight, is we already know what this is. This is a defensive downward spiral. This is what is taught to fighter pilots, or certainly was taught to them when dogfighting is a particularly key element of what they do. And so you can find, air service manuals from the 1960s that show literally exactly the same pattern. And it's because there's only so many ways in which to solve this problem, which is somebody sitting on your tail and you don't want them there, you want to sit behind their tail. But I find it astounding that you can have something like an F4 Phantom on the left, which might have a top speed of, I don't know, it's like Mach 2.4 times the speed of sound, and a housefly who's only traveling 3.5 meters per second. And yet they hit on very similar solutions to the problem. But it's also interesting to bear in mind that even when traveling at Mach 2.4 or whatever, your F4 Phantom, your big fighter plane, is only traveling 34 body lengths a second. The housefly, at a much slower speed, is traveling at 500 or more body lengths per second. So actually, what does that mean? Well, that's just effective scaling. As things get smaller, they travel more body lengths per second. But it means everything is happening so much faster. It means the time of reaction has to be faster and faster and faster. And that's a really driving force. You don't want big, complex brains that take time to process information. You have to be as fast as possible, because your small size means things are coming at you incredibly fast. Or you have to make predictions. And that's something that we're looking at now, about the way in which houseflies can maybe predict some of these maneuvers coming up based on information that's accessible earlier. So I'll now come on to talk about another project that we've been working on for a while, which is mating with mayflies. And I'm sure I don't need to introduce the mayfly to most of the listeners to this particular audience, but this is a beautiful male ephemera. So it's one that you will probably find all over the British Isles. And as most people are aware, mayflies are on a very limited time budget. Time is possibly the most valuable resource that they have. That and the fuel that they're given when they become adults. Because as adults, they're not going to feed anymore. What they've got is it. They can burn their fat reserves and whatever carbohydrates they have stored, but that's it. They're not getting any more fuel. And the really weird thing is, you should expect them to be really conservative with that fuel then, because that would allow them the greatest amount of time to search for females, because searching for females is basically all that they do. At least, that's all the males are doing. But instead, we see them do this. And so these are some filmed on a common just around the back from my house. And you can see here this repeated maneuver that is characteristic of mayflies all over the world. Not all of them do exactly the same pattern, but this is certainly the most common pattern, which is to constantly vertically climb up into the air, only to parachute back down. Now, if you knew you were never going to have another meal and time was your most valuable resource, why on earth would you spend it basically climbing up and down stairs repeatedly? That's a bit of a puzzle. And I think it's really interesting why they don't just fly on a level round in a circle or fly in any other pattern. So why would you do this constant rise and then descent? Because as far as we can make out, and as far as the energy calculations work out, it looks like it's less efficient than even hovering into a breeze or something like that. So we have this weird behavior, and we've been looking at this and trying to work out why on earth this might be advantageous to do. One thing is, like a hoverfly, you're already airborne, and your flight system is already raring to go by the time that female might happen to fly overhead. And then that might give you the slightest chance or slightest advantage over all of the other males. If you happen to be the top of your pattern, as the female comes over, it might mean that there's a shorter distance to cover. But it's still a bit of a puzzle. Why wouldn't you just kind of hover at that top position? Why would you go up and down? Well, okay, let's break this down a little bit. So when they see this female, what does that look like? Well, the normal flight looks like this. You just fly up and down with really controlled flight speeds. You're going up to like at a vertical speed of about 1 meter per second, and you're going down at a kind of negative vertical speed of about 1.3 meters per second. That's really well controlled. But when you see a female here marked in blue, you can see the red male is chasing after her. The flight behavior is completely different. He's not pausing his flight. He's constantly flapping. He's constantly on the aggressive. So it's kind of this switch. Something has switched his behavior into, that's a female, I need to go and chase it. There are hundreds of male mayflies in this area, and they're all sitting, within 1 meter or 2 of the ground. And they're all doing this vertical behavior, and then just occasionally one of them switches and locks onto something that's going past and begins chasing it. And so the initial way in which we thought about this was, there must be something really special about female mayflies. There must be something that male can see that instantly tells him that's a female. There's some sort of coloration, or there's some sort of pattern, or some sort of ultraviolet reflection. And so we could have looked at what's special about female mayflies and looked for that. There was a much simpler experiment we could do, and it showed that that's not true at all. You can have pretty much any object you want. And here I've got a 2.5 centimeter or 1 inch black sphere. So that's a jet black sphere. And the males will chase that quite happily. I can switch it to a 5 centimeter sphere. So much bigger, and they will still go up. And actually, if I hold this still for long enough, they will go up and try and mate with this sphere, suggesting they really don't have any idea what a female mayfly looks like. What they know is they need to chase dark contrasting targets. But then why aren't they chasing all of these other males? And we were thinking about the ways in which maybe some of this flight pattern could be to do with avoiding getting confused for a female if you fly over other males. Well, the way in which they chase them is also very interesting. They don't chase like the houseflies, just pointing their body at it. They chase much more like we saw with the robber flies right at the start. So you can see this mayfly makes a turn at the start and then flies along the path of the target. It doesn't head straight for the target, but it heads for a future meeting point. And this is interception. So it's heading for a future meeting point. It's a much more efficient way of hitting a target. It also keeps you below the target as you get into it, rather than kind of chasing along behind it. And we can look at how they solve this by using our 3D reconstructions. So that's what you can see happening on the left. As my target bobs backwards and forwards, you can see the mayfly moving onto a newer interception course and updating that interception course constantly. Well, the way in which they do this, and I'm not going to get bogged down in exactly why this works, but they just correlate their turning effort, which is how much effort they're putting into turning their path, with the angular movement that they see in the target, how fast the target is moving. And they just try and stabilize that. And they apply turning effort in linear proportion. So if the amount of angular movement doubles, the turning effort also doubles. And that's a wonderfully linear behavior right there. So we can then analyze why that's a good solution and start comparing that to engineered solutions. And we can see that there's also a bit of a delay of about 58 milliseconds, which is still probably in the region of 3 or 4 times faster than our own reaction speeds. So it's an astonishingly regularized controlled behavior. But I really, to come back to why they might be doing this bobbing behavior, in the bobbing flight, the rest of the swarm is always clustered more or less around the horizon. So you can see that over here in blue, we have the darker that color is, or the more color there is in that area, the more times you're seeing another mayfly in that area. And so you can see that the horizon is really where you're going to see all the other males. And any male that you see up high is only going to be there for a short amount of time before he drops back down. Whereas chase targets are only ever above the horizon and often quite a long way. So generally we get most of the targets above 45 degrees of the horizon. And so they're really sitting directly underneath. Now, of course, if you have this bobbing behavior, you're going up and down, you are avoiding flying over the top of any other mayfly. And also it's more stable than if you're all hovering in place and then maybe another mayfly might lock onto you and go and intercept you. And that's going to be a really important thing for using your time most effectively. We do actually see male mayflies lock onto each other and then go and try and mate with each other. And I'm not going to pass any value judgments, but at least evolutionarily, that seems like a bit of a wasted time. And so it's this kind of complex way of separating out who is male and who is female by the females are the ones that fly overhead. If you see something overhead, just chase it. And it's again, this way of simplifying everything down, simplifying the information so that you could be really, really fast in your reactions and really finely tuned to what you need to do. And that's some of the theory we're working on. There's other aspects to it as well. And I'd welcome any comment or other ideas that you think we haven't considered with this. But there's one final aspect, which is that mayflies, or at least most mayflies, have these long tails, generally 3, sometimes 2, so that extend out behind their body. Now, this will act a bit like the rudder of a firework or something to kind of stabilize them on path. And so it could be a kind of flight control element. But another element that happens is that they keep them tightly together when they're flying in a straight line and then spread them out as they make these turns. And you can see here that causes them to slow down. Well, it's not very obvious here, but that's exactly what it's going to do. It acts like an air brake. So why, if you're chasing something, would you want to activate an air brake? Well, actually, it's kind of like braking if you're driving a Formula One car. You don't take all your corners at full speed. And that's because the slower you go, the tighter the corner you can turn. And that works just as well in the air. So here you can see mayflies spreading their tails as they make turns. And my working hypothesis, although I don't have any evidence really beyond a hypothesis, is that they're spreading these tails at the turn to make that turn that little bit faster so that they can stay locked onto a potential female who might be zigging or zagging left or right and stay underneath her. So we've seen all 3 of those different kinds of behaviors. We've seen right the way from feeding through to fighting and then on to mating. Well, how do you switch between doing different tasks? So this is a wonderful Taiwanese dragonfly I was lucky enough to work on last year called Trithemis aurora. Dragonflies have quite separated eyes, similar to what I showed you with the rubberfly at the start. They've got a lot more lenses to begin with. These lenses are divided between areas around the kind of horizon, which are smaller lenses, closer packed together, and lenses right on top of the head that are much larger. These ones on top of the head give them greater resolution. So it gives them kind of really fine resolution. And they're able to see small targets a long way off. Whereas these ones around the horizon, slightly poorer resolution, but there's more of them. And so you can see a greater kind of field of view around you. And of course, like most of the insects I've discussed already, they're running a completely separate visual system at the same time. So here we have the ocelli, which are 3 camera-type eyes, and camera-type eyes meaning like ours, that sit right in the center over what I like to think of the nose. I know it has a technical name, but over the nose, they have these separate camera-type eyes, which are actually defocused. They don't form an image, or at least not a strong kind of what you would think of as an image, but instead are very good at detecting where light is. And that'll become important later. And we'll come back to thinking about the differences between those 2 eyes. But most of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis is this. So this is a Trithemis aurora male sitting on top of a perch. And you can see his entire body and head tilt over to one side. And then he's tracking a target as it goes overhead. And then he's going to take off and pursue that target. And what that pursuit looks like, or indeed it's an interception, is you're going to see the target in blue and the dragonfly go up in red. Again, it looks exactly like the robber fly, and that's because they use very similar mechanisms to bring about this collision and to bring about this catch. To catch the target out of the air, they're heading for a future meeting point. And this is a reconstruction in 3D. And again, we're going to see a very similar pattern. They're staying below the target. This looks like both the robber fly at the start. It also looks like the mayfly. It's the same type of structure. But then that's not all they do. So I'll let this little clip play out. Hopefully it is playing. There we go. So occasionally the males will take off and they're not seeking prey. They're actually going to cruise around their territory. And so that's what you'll see here is a dragonfly, the Trithemis, cruising around the pond. And as he does this, and as he patrols this territory, he's going to come into contact with other males of the same species and sometimes of different species, and they're going to enter into an interaction. So suddenly, this is a territorial, this is a fighting. It has similar ideas. You're chasing or navigating around another moving object. And we know that they chase prey with this kind of predation, interception style. But how does this change if you're suddenly chasing something that's the same species? And so you can see here some of that behavior as the two males are chasing each other. Well, to go back to why this is different, if you are in a predation scenario and you are the prey, this is very much like being a kind of little Cessna and looking out the window and you see a dragonfly, which is basically an F-22 Raptor, some incredibly terrifying fighter plane. That's only going to go one way. There is very little that you are capable of doing to get out of this scenario. In fact, it's kind of more, a lot of it is luck as to whether or not you turn at just the right moment. And, you know, there are ways in which you could improve your chances, but still, it's not great. But actually, if you're another dragonfly, suddenly it's a bit like you also happen to be flying an F-22 Raptor. And that's the critical difference between what we think of as missile interceptions like predation, where it's a missile really can outmaneuver anything that your plane or your target does, versus a dogfight. And a dogfight is between two individuals who are mutual and symmetric. They're able to outmaneuver each other, and they're really on a kind of level pegging. And so does this change the behavior? You can see exactly that here. So this is what the chase looks like between two dragonflies as they're kind of flying around each other and pursuing. They're swapping roles, and suddenly this looks exactly like the housefly and the chases that the housefly does over a larger spatial scale. So this no longer looks like an interception. They're no longer just sitting under the other target and going up and catching it. Something else entirely has taken over. And they're actually using different bits of the eye to do this. So this figure takes a little bit of explaining. So overhead of the dragonfly that we see in the center is where the visible sky is. And that's kind of shown by we've averaged what the visual scenery looks like at different levels around the dragonfly. Now around the top, you can see it goes white because that's where the sky is. And prey, so small targets, are always seen against the sky, pretty much. They're always being hunted against the sky. That gives much better contrast. It allows the dragonfly to stay underneath, go and hit them from the blind spot. Whereas when they're interacting with conspecifics, other members of the same species, they're much lower. They're below the horizon. They're being seen against foliage. And it's going to be a different bit of the eye. It's going to set different control and constraints. And what's interesting is that's also going to mean that any colors that you have are going to be much more evident. So both the one that's you're chasing and what the one that you're chasing can see of you, you're both going to be able to see each other's color a lot more. Whereas if you're chasing something that's prey overhead, it's a silhouette and you're going to be much less able to distinguish color. And we can project these both of where they see these targets onto the visual field. And so I'm spinning around an idea of a dragonfly whose head is at this dot here. And we see that their prey is almost always up and in that cone, which is being seen by that high resolution bit of the eye that I talked about right at the start. But actually, your conspecifics, the other ones like you, they're all seen around the horizon. And so you've got this swap. But it's more than just saying, oh, qualitatively they look different. It's interesting that they don't seem to actually steer to hit each other. And I think that's really fascinating, is that we would think, well, that's what you're threatening to do. You should steer to go and hit another male so that he stays out of your territory. But of course, if you're both pretty similar size, a collision is dangerous, irrespective of whether you're the one initiating the collision or the one suffering it, both of you are kind of ramming into each other. So what we instead see is in every single one of these 3D reconstructed dragonfly fights, the red dragonfly, who is the chaser, has more speed than blue. And in an analytical sense, in a way that you can work out, has plenty of speed and maneuverability to hit the blue target if he wanted to. He is steering in such a way to stay close and continuously maneuver himself into a kind of position below and behind blue, but at no point is he actually just steering directly to hit. And I must have collected, I think it was 500 stereo paired videos of these guys interacting, and in not a single one did males actually collide. And I think that's really fascinating, because it must mean that the threat of collision is really bad. Because otherwise, why would this blue dragonfly pay any attention to this other male? You know, if it's all threats, what's the point? Unless, of course, that collision is really, really bad. And so that threat doesn't need to be very real for it to be enough for you to say, oh, okay, let's not even risk this. But there's kind of another element which is related again, and you're going to see it here. I'll let this video play again. So these are two of these trithemis interacting. And right about this point, one of them circles around and gets behind the other. And again, this is similar to what I was talking about with the houseflies, that unlike in the predation, the initial evader, the one in blue, is able to switch tails and turn on the initial chaser and end up in this kind of prime position, sitting just behind the other. And so the way this works in dragonflies, or at least in the species of dragonflies that we've studied so far, is that they make a turn and a dive. And it's this turn and dive combined that really seem to put them directly behind this other target. And we're working out why visually this is hard for the other dragonfly to follow. Why doesn't the dragonfly behind simply follow this maneuver? But this is the way in which dragonflies are maneuvering against each other. I think this is really interesting, because this is a kind of weird maneuver. I could go and chat to my friends in the RAF or friends that kind of work with aerial combat, and they don't recognize this behavior. This is kind of something a bit different. So I think it's really fun to play with why this might be happening. So it's really starting with, you have an invasion start, you have a sharp bank over to one side. They pull up, which effectively pulls them towards the ground. It's pulled up from their direction, which is way over sideways, and enter into a steep vertical dive that they then come out of in this chase position directly behind the target. And while they do this, they're going to stay in this position, the kind of visual position of the one that's behind them. They're going to stay still, and then suddenly drop straight past them in a way that the chasing dragonfly isn't able to follow. And when it does this, it might travel at 5,000 degrees per second. So it's really, really, really fast downwards past them. And we think that that just simply means that the dragonfly that's doing the chasing isn't able to track or isn't able to follow that behavior. It's too fast. But what happens if they are able to do it? What happens if you start that evasion a bit too early? Well, hopefully this is a little bit familiar by now, and it relates to some of the stuff I was talking about with the houseflies. So here you're going to see the blue and red spiral downwards towards the ground before blue eventually does a little swap with red and does get behind. This is symmetric maneuvering again. This is the two individuals that are mutually able to interact, spiraling around each other. We've seen it in the houseflies, and it's mirrored in flying a plane. It's also mirrored in dragonflies. And actually, I would urge you, when you're out and about, or if you have houseflies cruising underneath your lampshade and you might get a little bit annoyed at them, just watch them for long and you'll see these spirals. I've seen it in bee flies, I've seen it in butterflies, I've seen it in a couple of other species that don't come to mind, where you get these two males spiraling around each other, a contest of how quickly you can turn, a real kind of contest of agility, rather than a contest of strength. It's also a contest of senses. You've got to remain tracked onto this other target. You've got to keep a visual perspective on it. I think it's really interesting if we could start getting these to happen in lab environments or in more controlled environments. We can start understanding really what is at test here and who wins this engagement, who ends up coming out of this spiral the winner, who is Top Gun of the insect world. And so before I move on to the last section, just a kind of question as to why, like, what exactly is the contest? What are the agility metrics that limit how these insects can move? Because we think about they should be able to maneuver in every single way, right? But actually, they can't just turn a sharp right angle whilst traveling at high speed. It's not possible. In the same way that if you did that in a car, you'd drift around the corner, or worse. In this instance, the insects are constrained. Now, what are the constraints on something like a plane? Well, if we go back to our F4 Phantom, this dogfighting plane, and we look at the turn rate, how fast they're able to turn versus their airspeed, there's a really characteristic relationship that you see. And that's the faster you go, the worse your turn rate is, provided you have enough force. Before, you have to have enough airspeed. So below a kind of maximum turn rate, you've got less and less air going across the wings. So that's at slower airspeeds, right the way down to your stall speed at which you can't turn at all. You have this maximum turn rate that happens at some intermediate airspeed. Then after that, you can no longer keep turning at that rate, both because inertia or momentum is going to lead you a cropper, but also because even if you could generate enough force, either your aeroplane or your pilot would fall to bits. And it's a kind of open question as to which one of those would happen first. It's generally not a good idea to do either. And so we don't see them occupying any space beyond this G limit. And that G limit might be something like 5G, 4G, whatever is a sustainable tolerance for either the human pilot or the aircraft. But what do we see in the dragonflies if we try and plot airspeed versus the turn rate? We see a very similar curve. They do seem to be obeying certain limits in terms of their G, and they stick to around 4 or 5G, which is pretty impressive. You are going to feel 4 or 5G. But what is interesting, and if I show this to a bunch of engineers, they get very excited by this, is that you don't get this drop off towards a stall speed. Of course you don't. Dragonflies aren't fixed wing aircraft. They can switch to being a helicopter when they need to, and indeed can hover to bring them down onto a perch or just to hover in space. And so as you move towards that lower speed, their turn rate just goes up and up and up. And so the way in which a dragonfly or another maneuvering insect can use speed is very different to a plane. They're not facing exactly the same trade-offs. And I think it'd be really interesting to start looking at the ways in which this ability to move their wings and to jet thrust around, which is what they're doing, they're kind of similar to like a Harrier jump jet, able to push that force around, what that enables them to do while they're fighting in the air. I'm talking of like weird things and the trade-offs that are happening in the air to do with control. I'm going to come and talk about the last rather non sequitur element of the talk, which is recent work that we've been doing on how light affects insects in their flight at night. So we really set up with this question of what data is out there for insects flying around light, because we see these weird patterns and they're visible to the naked eye. And we know that insects aggregate around these bright light sources. That's something that pretty much every human being on Earth knows. And it's probably something that every human being for the last 200,000 years has noticed as they sat around a campfire, is that occasionally insects would drop out of the sky straight into the middle of that campfire. And the flight that you see around something like a bulb makes it look like the insect's trapped. It looks like a maladaptive behavior. Something's gone wrong and it's got stuck. But what can that possibly be? What is trapping them there? So we looked at some of the extant hypotheses and some of the data that's already out there. There actually, until now, has not been very much just free flight behavior in moths or other night flying insects around artificial lights. That's because if you're working with film cameras or various other different systems, it's quite tough to film insects full stop, let alone to work out what they're doing whilst you're filming them, let alone at night or in the field where you might want to observe this. So it's really only that we were able to kind of start this question because we had access to these high-speed cameras that were able to film in infrared at night and were portable. So we could take them out to the rainforest if we wanted to, which of course we did want to. So here we have kind of the extant hypothesis. We have direct attraction. So that might be they're escaping towards perceived gaps in foliage. And certainly that would make sense. And that might be why flies repeatedly bang into windows and this sort of thing, is that they're occasionally in situations where they need to get out of a confined space and they use the light as an index of a gap. They might be attracted to thermal radiation. That's an older theory, and I think generally pretty well disproved now, given that LEDs still bring insects down and can actually be worse than, say, something that's much chucking out much more thermal radiation. So we don't really think it's the thermal radiation. Also, you can just put hot objects outside, and that doesn't bring insects in the same way. So what about this indirect attraction? What about other mechanisms? And probably the one that's most popular, or at least the one that's most commonly cited, is this idea that it's subversion of some sort of celestial compass. there's something about the way in which insects detect which way they're traveling that's being ruined by this light. And maybe they're trying to think it's the moon and keep it as a compass cue. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Or you could have something like a zone of confusion, where the light itself is causing local adaptation to the eye, causing a change in the eye that is going to make the area around the light look that much darker. Now, then the hypothesis is the insect is actually flying for the darker region around the light that it perceives and not the light itself. And I put that particularly in here because that's a really beautiful paper, because it involves attaching lots and lots of moths to tiny little polystyrene tiny polystyrene boats, and then floating them on a mixture of oil and freon, and then allowing them to swim around in that by flapping around their tiny little boats, using their lift forces to propel the boat around. And it's a really beautiful way of getting at this problem without actually needing to record the insect in flight. And so I really recommend that paper. The way we approached this was, yes, using the high-speed cameras that I've already shown you at the start, and also using a motion capture. So this motion capture is where we can add tiny little retroreflective markers. And these markers are a bit like cat's eyes in the road. They bounce light back along the axis it came. So that allows them to be a really bright spot. Even when the background might be quite dark, they're bouncing much more light than the surrounding area back to the cameras. We add 3 markers onto the back of the insect. And that allows us to not only tell where the animal is, but by looking at the placement of these different markers, we can tell what orientation it is. So we can see if it's flying sideways, maybe it's upside down, or whether it's the right way up, whatever that might be. The camera system itself has these motion capture cameras. So this is something that's used in cinema, it's used in games and TV. It's a way of capturing motion. It's kind of annoying, but it's the best way to put it, is that these little markers bouncing the light back can be thresholded. They can just be seen by the camera and picked out. And then they're bouncing light back towards the camera's seeing them, taking the marker positions, and then by pairing between all 8 of our cameras, we could provide a really wide coverage with high resolution. And the resolution here is very fantastic for this kind of work. So we can get down to about 1/4 of a millimeter in positional space for each of these markers. And that gives us about an error on the orientation of the animal of about 5 degrees. So we can see the position really accurately, and we can tell where they're tilted. So, do we see direct attraction? Do we see insects fly directly towards light sources, at least within a lab or in a field environment? This would be symptomatic of something like an escape response, or various other different ideas. But indeed, that's exactly what we don't see. So on the right, you'll see an atlas moth. And unfortunately, that's annoying. One of my videos isn't playing. Okay, well, one of the videos just doesn't want to play. On the left, you would see, if it were playing, a common darter dragonfly that's doing exactly the same behavior as the one on the right, which is the atlas moth, flying around in a repeated circle, not flying directly to the light and landing on it. Both of these are pretty maneuverable, capable of flying insects. If they want to land on something, they generally can. So that would suggest they're not just directly attracted and confusing it for, say, a hole in a tree, because otherwise they'd fly directly towards it. And so here you should see, sorry, it appears all my videos have just stopped working. That's an annoyance. What you would see here is a 3D reconstruction of each of these little markers as the insect is traveling around and around the light. So you'd see this going round and round in repeated circles around the light, rather than flying directly towards the light. And so that really argues against direct attraction. So we can look at some of the indirect attraction models and see whether they might support it. So the most popular one, or the one, that I said was most commonly likely to be encountered, was the idea that the moon is an effectively infinitely distant source. So then what does an infinitely distant source really mean? Well, it means your movement is meaningless for the actual distance between yourself and the object. So as a moth flies along, it can keep a constant direction of flight. And by fixing this angle, and maybe change it over time as the Earth rotates, but generally fixing this angle that the animal is traveling relative to the moon, it can continue traveling in a straight line over really long distances. And we know definitely the insects do this. They use both the sun and the moon as lunar compasses. They can also use the Milky Way as well, or various other features of the light environment to continue traveling in a straight line over long periods of time. The question really is, do they treat artificial sources of light as the moon? Do they try to hold a kind of fixed angle and that leads them in a spiral that should go in towards the center? And so one of the ways in which we tested this was the idea that as the insect is traveling around a bulb, so it's traveling in a circle repeatedly around the bulb, we should expect, if we switch to a new bulb, the insect should continue circling in the same direction. So if it was going clockwise on the first bulb, it should continue going clockwise on the second bulb, because that would be characteristic of keeping the moon either on a fixed angle on your left or a fixed angle on your right. Whereas it would argue against this if we saw them just switching between whether keeping it on the left or the right. And so that's what we set about doing. And so this was another thing I filmed in my garden. I'm going to just exit and try and reload this and just see if it'll play if I just reload it. Hey, there we go. Look at that. So here I've got actually a period butterfly flying in a circle in one direction around the light. As it comes up in between, I'm going to switch to the other light. And what you've just seen there is a complete change in direction. It's just swapped from orbiting in an anti-clockwise way to orbiting in a clockwise way. It's switched from having the light on its right-hand side to having it on its left-hand side. I think I've got that the right way around. Might have that the wrong way around, but the rest of it is correct. That they have swapped the direction of orbit, suggesting they've swapped which side of their body they're keeping the light on. This argues against a lunar model, because you wouldn't expect this, because that's the equivalent of you exactly traveling back along the path that you just came in on. So could it be something else? And that was where we sat down and we started thinking about other things about insect flight that could be confused by light at night and the way in which insects process the environment so that they can fly. Well, one key thing to understand about flight is that the sky is almost always brighter than the ground. And that almost is doing a lot of heavy lifting, because actually it's basically always brighter than the ground. And this is particularly strong in shorter wavelengths like UV. The contrast between the sky and the ground in UV is very, very strong. And that's true even at night. Even if everything is much darker, the contrast is still there. The sky is brighter than the ground. So insects, along with fish, squid, marine invertebrates, aquatic invertebrates, they all show a very strong dorsal light response. Now, why do they have this? Well, it's because working out which way is up, if you're flying or if you're swimming, is actually very hard. It's very difficult to work out which way is up because your body can be moved around in the medium that it's in, and you can feel all these accelerations like G-forces, but these are completely indistinguishable to actual gravity. You can't say what is I'm being accelerated by the medium I'm in versus that is the direction of gravity. But if the direction of light is always up, gravity should always be in the opposite direction. And so what you can do is you can say that an insect in an unstable flight posture, say tilted over to one side, should tilt itself so that its back is facing towards that light, because then its flight forces are aimed down and it's going to be cancelling out gravity. Really, really beautiful, really, really simple. It's the perfect, well, it's a really neat solution. Maybe not the perfect solution, but it's a really good solution for insects to use. It's so beautifully robust. It's mediated by both the compound eye and by the ocelli. So both of them are doing different components of that. And that's a lot of what the ocelli, which are right, again, over the front of the nose, that's a lot of what they're doing. But how is this affected by artificial light? And I said this was such a beautiful, robust response, but the problem is it really doesn't work if something else starts making a lot of light that isn't the sky. So you have insects that might be in a stable flight posture, are seeing lights that might be at the horizon level or off at an angle or even below them, and then maybe tilting their body towards that bright light field to adopt a weird flight posture. Now, if you take a helicopter or a plane or anything like that and you tilt it over to one side, suddenly its flight forces are off axis from gravity, and that's going to lead to it spiraling or all kinds of other flight patterns. And so we went to test this in the field. And of course, we didn't just go to any field. We used what money we could to go to Costa Rica, because why wouldn't you, to go and record as many different insects as we could, flying around lights at night in various different experimental conditions. And so we saw a few different what we're calling behavioral motifs, types of behavior. And so here we have a hawk moth that's flying up and stalling. It's losing airspeed as it tries to fly and then cruising onto a new path. But in each of these, it's actually keeping its back to the light. And we assume, therefore, thinking that the light is the sky, but it's keeping its back to the light, but that's actually not the right direction. It's not producing enough flight forces. That's pretty weird. That's a pretty weird behavior. We have orbiting, which is that the insect is traveling in a near perfect circle repeatedly. And in really still nights, you can get this happening in minutes at a time as this little moth circles around the light. It's tilted, it's rolled over to one side as it does this. And then finally, we have possibly the most kind of categorical example of this, which is inversion, which is insects that as they flew directly over the light source are going to flip themselves upside down and crash down out of the air because all of a sudden their flight forces are not cancelling out gravity. And this isn't currently explained by other theories that have been around, but is exactly what we would expect for confusion of the dorsal light response. And all three of these different types of behavior can be described as this. So I've just mapped this out one more time, that stalling behavior really seems to be that they're kind of a pitch offset. So they're pitching up to keep that light over their back. That's pushing their forward force higher and higher into the air, but actually they don't have enough force to climb like that. And so they're tilting and they're ending up on a new flight path. You have orbiting behavior, which is where the dorsal axis or their back is tilted towards the light as they're flying horizontally, leading them to travel in a big circle round and round. And then we have this inverting behavior, where they see the light beneath them, think that's the sky, and flip upside down and crash down out of the air. We should therefore be able to fix this by changing the direction of the light. So if the light's coming from above them, we should expect them to, the moth or the insect, to fly right side up and fly normally, even if it's artificial light. But if that reflected light is coming from beneath, we should expect them to crash. So we set up the same bulb and the same sheet in two different orientations. The light facing downward, as though you would do if you were moth trapping, and the light facing upward onto a sheet that's stretched across a kind of canopy. And then, so you have the same glowing object, but it's either above the insect or it's below the insect. And indeed, what we see is that when it's below the insect repeatedly crash into this surface. But you do that same thing and you have it above them, and they can cruise along underneath it just fine. They don't seem to show any abnormal flight patterns. And so this is 3D reconstructions of both of those. We have the point light source on the left, where you can see those really tight turns and clustering in around the light source, versus the diffuse ceiling, which is on the right, where you can see much more linear paths that look more like the way in which insects normally fly around. And we can break down some of the statistics on how they fly and show that under a diffuse ceiling, they're looking much more natural. That doesn't mean you should light everything like a diffuse ceiling, because actually that's not going to work when they come to the edge of where that light is. But while they're underneath this canopy, it seems to work pretty well at writing their flight. And then finally, we could use this to build simulations, and we can just base it on, well, there's a certain amount of force going forwards, a certain amount of force going up out of their body, and they're tilting their body towards the light. You don't really need to read through exactly what's going on there, but just that they're tilting their backs towards the light, and we've given them pretty regular flight forces for what an insect should have. And what we get, at least qualitatively, looks a lot like the behavior we see in insects around light. And that this tilting can explain most of the behavior that we see when these insects are near light. I should stress we don't know what's happening beyond a few meters. Most of our study was concerned with just within a few meters of the light. So in summary about this portion of the work, insects definitely do tip their dorsal axis, their back, towards where bright light sources are as a stabilizing reflex. And this behavior generally explains most of the weird flight paths that we see of insects around light at night. The same effect is what's causing them to crash and to trap them around light. But then once they get knocked down and they get crashed near that light, they're going to start going to sleep. They're going to think it's the day, and all these other effects start happening. But there's still things we don't know. And so we don't know the different spectral tuning responses for different insects. We don't know how different lights affect different insects in flight. Definitely seems to be a difference between diurnal and nocturnal insects. We don't know how they deal with things like the sun and moon in level flight, because those are really discrete point sources of light that can sometimes be near the horizon. We don't know how they filter that out. Or maybe if they're flying near the mouth of a cave, how they don't just turn sideways because one side's really dark and one side's really bright. We don't know how they deal with that. And we also don't really know where the dorsal light response comes from, where it is in the brain, where it is in the neurons, and how this is all worked out. And so I'd really like to thank everyone who's helped along the way, including my boss, Dr. Lin at the top left, and my collaborator, Dr. Sundhi, who is particularly, he's a real moth expert, and also a lot of my funding and the rest of my lab. And I will leave us with an experiment you can do in your back garden, albeit if you feel particularly mean to flies. This is a box of flies that I've just quickly sweep netted up. And you put them in a box and you have a UV light from beneath. And what you'll see is this: they cannot fly and they'll constantly land upside down. So I'm going to have a selection of different insects that are all getting confused by light that's coming from underneath here. And you can see them all flip their way upside down. The only ones who are completely able to deal with this are fruit flies. And I'll leave that as a little mystery for now. But I'm very happy to answer any questions or comments on the work. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was fascinating stuff, actually, really amazing. Zoe, were you going to just handle any questions for us?
Yes, actually, I'm just going to give people just a moment or two to put some questions into the chat. So if you've got anything for Sam, now is the time. Get onto the keyboard, please. But I just wanted to throw in a comment of my own at this point. That was an amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. And as an observation straight off, I'm just guessing that none of us are going to be watching insects in quite the same way this year now, after listening to that. I bet a lot of us are going to be taking our outdoor walks around the springtime and looking at seeing if we can spot some of these behaviours ourselves. I know I am. I've already got plans to be down by the river in Oxford to have a look at the mayflies as they bounce around this spring. So it's going to bring a whole new meaning to my walks as I'm out at lunchtime.
Just on that note, one source of entertainment is most insects, not all of them, don't know what a female looks like, and that includes the mayflies. So if ever you find yourself near a bunch of flies or something, if you get even just a conker, a nut, a stone off the ground, you throw it, you'll see a whole collection of insects chase after it. I always think that's terrific fun. It works really well on mayflies as well. If you throw a tennis ball over a bunch of mayflies, you'll see the entire swarm go nuts for it. So I'd recommend that.
This sounds like I've just created my new away day material for the entomology team in Oxford. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Guess what we're doing this spring. So that's marvellous. So one or two comments popping up now. Thank you, people, for getting onto the keyboard. We had an early remark from Linda, who was asking about maybe some of the differences in dragonfly species that you might be seeing in the field. She commented that emperor dragonflies tend to spend a lot of time quite high up over meadows and things. Maybe this is a behaviour thing, but she did wonder if there is a difference in the eyes between species and whether you'd looked into that yet.
So there are lots of different. So that's a really good point. The reason I worked on the Trithemis, and the wonderful thing about working in Taiwan is you've got lots and lots of different species around a single pond. But it's the same here. You have the Trithemis there are very similar to our common darter dragonflies. But of course, you have things like the emperors, the anax, that are much larger. And their territoriality is quite different. They don't carve up a pond into small sections, an average small sized pond. They say this pond is mine. And you'll have it tends to be a male that will be flying for meters and meters, about 2 or 3 meters in the air, and he'll be flying around and around the boundary of his perimeter and enter into chases. And I don't have that much data yet to say how similar or different those flights are. And I think that's a really interesting question. So coming this year, hopefully we'll be going back to Taiwan, and we hope to look at some different species and then start making comparisons. The eyes themselves, so the reason that you get this difference in eye, and it's not only in dragonflies and robber flies, it's in lots of other flies or any other insect that needs to see a really tight point source or see a really tight target, you get these really large lenses, is because large lenses allow you high resolution. You can't get high resolution with a very, very small lens. It's simply just a property of the optics. Whereas actually, if your head is already very big because you're a bigger insect, you don't have to trade off as much. And so if you look at the eyes of emperors, they're much more even. The size of the lenses is quite continuous around the eye, and they have a lot more lenses. I think the top numbers are like 24,000 lenses, which is 24,000 individual pixels. Whereas yeah, as you get to smaller and smaller dragonfly species, you get a more and more of a kind of discrimination between the side of the eye, which has very small lenses, and the top of the eye, which then has proportionally much larger lenses. And another species that we want to look at this summer is the very smallest dragonfly species in the world, which is something called Nanophyre pygmaea. And it's a dragonfly that's about 1.5 centimeters long, absolutely adorable little guys. And I really want to see the way in which they're going to fight each other in the air or chase after targets, because they should be pushing against some really, really like strong constraints. But no, that's a really great question. I think the comparison is one of the great advantages of insects.
Yes, no, I'm excited to see what comes out of that research too. And I'm having a tiny squee on the inside about the idea of a little dragonfly like that. So
oh, they're so cute. Oh, no, they're just adorable. And they're scarlet dwarfs. They're bright scarlet and tiny little fellas. So yeah, yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, that should be amazing. Few questions on the moths coming in now.
Yeah, of course.
So Daffyd has commented that some of the things you were talking about, those different behaviours from different species as they're coming in towards the light, might help explain why some moth species will settle away from a moth trap rather than entering it. Because as I'm sure everyone here has observed, you don't get everybody hitting the box in the middle. They do tend to scatter around.
Again, like the work we've put out so far is all highlighting, oh, it's so similar, this is one behavior. Whereas the second thing that we're working on is, oh, it's all different. They're all crazy different. Because the way that this response, which might be a constant response, they're tilting their backs towards the light, but the effect that has really just depends on the flight apparatus, the wings, the flight muscle, how the insect stays airborne. And so we tested hawk moths, the oleander hawk moth, and in the lab, they would fly directly over a UV light. And they're the only moth I've tested that's able to do that. But that's weird because they do fly to light traps in the field. Now, the fact they just completely ignored our light traps indoors and in the lab, it doesn't argue against our hypothesis. It just suggests it's far more complicated. That some insects at some time are switching off this response, and then at other times they seem to be engaging it. And that might be something to do with how fast they're flying or different types of flight. Because the hawk moth, when it's flying indoors, has this very vertical posture. But actually in the field, when they start flying fast, they're going to go horizontal. And maybe that makes them more unstable. And maybe then they start paying attention to where the light's coming from. That's purely conjecture. We don't know yet. But I think picking apart exactly that, different insect species, looking at the interaction they have with light, and then taking species whose names escape off the top of my head, who don't come to light, or you rarely find around light at night, and seeing if they're just not affected by this. They just don't show this same response. I think that could really start unpicking the kind of more complex effects that light at night can have on insect flight.
Great. I'm just going to follow this on with a question from Gavin, because he's asked, do you think there's any truth to the idea that moths are much more attracted to light early in their adult life rather than later?
So I've definitely seen that written down. I wouldn't be able to say which study off the top of my head. So particularly in adult hawk moths, are known that the more mature moths seem to be able to ignore light. And I'd say that most of the insects I was using in the lab, many of them would have been quite young, including the ones I caught outside, were generally quite young. I haven't specifically controlled for that. I think it would be very interesting because we tend to think of insects as ready from the get-go as soon as they hatch out, but there's reasonable amounts of work and there's more coming up. That there's tuning and filtering, and they're still learning. They're tuning their neural apparatus, they're tuning their brain as they learn and fly around. And so it might be that they just get better at dealing with light. I think that's a really interesting question, but it's not something we've looked into yet. It's one of many questions we'd like to get to.
Something for a future paper, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
And how about the idea that perhaps male moths are more attracted to lights than females?
So I tried both males and females, and actually most of the data in the paper came from males, but not because the females didn't show the response. We include all the data, the flight data that we have in our paper. The problem was that the females didn't want to fly. And that was a really kind of sustained problem. We had very similar conditions. We kept them. So for instance, with the Atlas moth, which is a ceternid and therefore doesn't feed as an adult. So we assume that, they had enough fuel from the get-go, but the female just would not take off. She would not fly around no matter the conditions. Whereas the male, it was actually tough to stop him flying. And so I think that a lot of the differences we're seeing are simply just how many insects happen to be flying, like who happens to be in the air. And again, we see that with, say, both dragonflies show a really strong light trap response, but we don't get very many in light traps, or at least I don't in the ones that I put in the garden. And that's probably just that they aren't flying that much when the light trap would confuse them. And so I think that probably signifies how much of the time different insects are spending in the air, and that's, you know, happening to fly past a light trap and get stuck.
It's probably something there to investigate around motivation between the sexes as well, I guess. It's just
Exactly.
what popped into my head as you were speaking,
Yeah.
nodding along in the background. Not that you can see me at the moment, but and then I've got a question from Ray. He says, you've not mentioned motion camouflage. I'm afraid I don't know what this is. So if you do, that would be good as an explanation.
So yes,
yeah,
I can talk all day about motion camouflage, but unfortunately I'm not a believer in motion camouflage. That's not quite true. That's very contentious in certain tiny little conference circles. Motion camouflage is the principle that as you're a dragonfly flying along, as your target dragonfly is flying horizontally, you should rise up to meet it as another dragonfly. But what you can do is you can change your speed and angle such that relative to that one that's flying overhead, you're not moving compared to the background. You're just flying directly kind of along these paths or lines that remain parallel with some point on the ground. And you're, I'm sorry, this is very hard to describe without large amounts of models and the drawing on the board. But basically, you're staying directly under it in such a way that you're not moving around in its visual field. And this comes from a paper, I think, in 2002 from Srinivasan and another author who escapes me. And I'm very sorry if it is you, Ray. But there's reasons why that would emerge not as an active mechanism, but as a sort of a passive emergent effect of steering in towards a target. And so there's only a couple of examples of actual traces where this is happening. I think there's 2 recordings where they seem to be obeying this behavior, but it's possible it could be an emergent phenomena from some of the maths and the geometry that happens. And so whether or not they're actively trying to do it, or at least for whether it's much of a component of their flight, is an open question. But it's certainly a very interesting idea. And it's one that a lot of engineers are trying to build into drones and all kinds of things. It's a fascinating concept.
That's great. I'm pleased to know the engineers are being kept busy and out of trouble.
Yeah,
trying to report that out for us. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your time, Sam. I've got one last question, if that's okay. I don't want to keep you on the line. It's just Roger has obviously, as many as us have, I think, whilst you were talking, especially about moths and the impact of light sources, have jumped to what effect light might be having in the environment on insect species, and whether or not it would be having an impact on migrating insects, particularly, for example, with all of our lights that we have put around our cities and towns. I don't know how much you've looked at this as a research subject, but I know it's very much in everybody's hearts and minds at the moment.
Absolutely. I think it's a really interesting question. So one thing is you're flying at high altitude and you have these big bright fields, like you have an illuminated city beneath you. That's going to be a big bright area that may cause you to invert or may kind of ruin your flight path, because at a kind of local level, suddenly your comparison between the sky versus this large field, which is the ground, which is all lit up, is that much more convincing that the ground is the sky and could lead you to crash. I don't know specifically whether, I don't know off the top of my head of studies that look at whether you find migratory species that much more than you would expect simply for the fact that they happen to be flying around and traveling long distances. Yeah, so there's so much to talk about. And so there's also, we're trying to link this to ways in which we can try and reduce the impact of light. So if we can understand the mechanism of what aggregates insects around light, then maybe we can start designing lights better. Really, the answer is switch them off. And that's the one I tell everyone. And everyone's like, oh, but can't we consume and buy our way out of this with different lights that I can sell to people? I'm like, no, just switch them off. That's the most effective light source you can have, is one that you switch off for reducing your effect. But possibly reducing the amount of light that we're chucking upwards and skywards might definitely help high-flying nocturnal species. But I'll leave it at one last thing, which is that I'm currently working with some German researchers who've been using radio tethers on the back of moths at night, and then seeing where they end up and whether they end up at lampposts and these kind of things. And the weird thing there is they're finding very few released insects, even at relatively, so talking, between 50 and 100 meters away from a light source, end up at that light source. And so we might start reevaluating the way in which light traps are sampling from the environment, rather than necessarily being some sort of magnet that's drawing insects out of the dark, as more being a kind of net or like a pitfall trap that's trapping insects that happen to be passing. Because I think they released about 100 insects, and of the 100 male moths, and of those only 2 ended up at the light source. And it's, a standard lamppost, and they had a ring of lampposts that they were releasing them in, and most of them were able to leave just fine or continue flying. So I think there's huge amounts more work to do, and I'm not trying to say that any of what I've said is final. Yeah, I think it's an interesting, new way to think about it.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much personally from me for your talk today, Sam. I'm now going to hand over to Ian Masters, who is going to give you the formal thanks on behalf of BENHS.
Thanks very much. Sam, thank you for a terrific presentation. I'm old enough to remember the appearance in 1975 of Born on the Wing by Stephen Dalton, which was a series of still images, remarkable for its period. But what you've described today has moved us on, not just incrementally, but exponentially in terms of the techniques that you've employed to show us exactly what is happening. Fascinating descriptions and evidence from your research of how insects behave. And of course, the final piece for those of us who are interested in moth trapping, an explanation that may be getting us closer to what is really happening with moths around lights. Sam, thank you so much on behalf of the Society and all those people who've joined us today for a fabulous presentation. I'm sure that we have many, many things that we now know that we had no clue about previously. So thank you.